So I wanted to discuss cognitive load theory with you. I'm not going to go very heavily into the theory. I want to give you just the basics of the theory, touch on some of the key elements of it. Uh, it can be a little confusing at times, so I'm going to keep it simple. And it's just going to serve as a good framework for us to think about what students are struggling with cognitively in the classroom, uh, whether it's what we want them to struggle with, and if a student is being cognitively overwhelmed, what can we do to make the load more manageable for them, but at the same time meet our learning goals. So cognitive load theory really focuses around the limited capacity of working memory or short-term memory. Uh, as we discussed in the information processing model, there's really not a lot of space we can hold in our mind at any one point in time. And this interacts with attention and executive function issues because in order to be able to hold information in your mind, you need to be focused on track. Distractors will easily get you off topic or bring in information into your mind that aren't part of your learning goal. Uh, you may find yourself hyper-focused on unable to switch to information that you need to process. So there's a heavy interaction between executive function challenges and the limitations of working memory. But in this theory, the key premise is you have this bottleneck that happens because we have such limited capacity in our working memory. And so when we're designing a learning activity, we really have to pay attention to whether or not we're overwhelming this limited capacity. And I'm going to introduce you to a couple of terms here. So the first one is cognitive load, which is essentially the mental effort that's being exerted to solve a task. The other two terms I want to explain are intrinsic processing load and extraneous load, and I'll get to those in a minute. So as we said, cognitive load is essentially the mental effort that you have to exert to solve a task. In cognitive load theory, there's two key forms of cognitive load. There's a third one, but I'm not gonna get into it right now. I'm just gonna keep it at the two critical ones for the work that we're gonna be doing today. One is called extraneous load, and this refers to any load that's not really part of your learning goal. Any learning activity you have, anything that's in a class or outside of it, is going to involve activities that aren't essential elements to your learning task, but it's including those is for the most part not completely avoidable. So for example, think about asking your students to work on a critical thinking essay. Students are going to have to struggle with spelling, they're going to have to struggle with grammar, they're going to have to struggle with a whole host of attention and focus challenges. And those are all mental processing tasks that they have to deal with at the same time that they're writing this critical thinking essay. So spelling would be an example of one extraneous load because it's not part of our goal. Our goal is to help students develop critical thinking. It's not necessarily something that's not worthwhile. It certainly is worthwhile, but it's not our particular learning goal in this instance. And so for this particular task, it would be an extraneous load. Another potential extraneous load might be something like sequencing in a multi-step algebra problem. If our learning goal is algebraic thinking, sequencing is certainly part of what you need to do to solve it, but it's not a core element of what we want taught. We certainly want a student to be able to appropriately sequence things as they solve the problem, but what we really are getting at with that problem is helping them think algebraically. Another example might be language processing in a word problem. Those are extraneous loads. They're not core elements of the learning task. Now, the other form of cognitive processing load that I want to introduce is the intrinsic load. And these essentially are cognitive loads that are core elements of your learning task. Again, this depends on what you've identified as your learning goals. So think about that critical thinking essay, and critical analysis is probably the element that's most critical to your learning goal. And so we would consider that an intrinsic load. That's a load we want students to struggle with because that's what's going to help them learn. Algebraic reasoning, again, might be a core element of an algebra word problem that a student is struggling with. That's the core element we want the student struggling with because that's the skill we want to develop. So we have, on the one hand, extraneous loads. These are not critical elements of our learning task. And we have intrinsic loads. They're the core elements of our learning task. And what counts as extraneous and what counts as intrinsic depends largely on what you set your learning goals to be. So spelling can be an intrinsic load if your goal is learning spelling. Sequencing can be an intrinsic load if your goal is to learn how to appropriately sequence a problem. The key is knowing what your specific learning goals are. So in general, learning can be really efficient when the total cognitive load doesn't exceed a student's or a learner's working memory capacity. So you can have some extraneous loads and some intrinsic loads, and as long as the two combined don't exceed a student's cognitive processing capacity, you'll have no problems. A student will be able to work on the problem, get through it, and learn in the process. However, learning can be slowed or may not happen at all if the cognitive loads are too high for students to manage. And there's two ways that could happen. It could be that the intrinsic load is beyond a student's ability. So we've set a goal for them that's not appropriate for that learner. It may be too ambitious. It may be beyond their age level. It may be an area where they don't have the core elements to perform this task. And in that case, what we need to do is maybe narrow our goals or scaffold the task to reduce that intrinsic load. Or what we might have is a really high extraneous load. And that's often the case with many of our students who suffer from executive function challenge or dyslexia or other disabilities that affect learning. In those cases, there's often a very heavy cognitive processing load that's unrelated to the core learning task we want the students to learn. So for example, you might have a student who is struggling to maintain focus in a classroom because of heavy distraction. And therefore they're exerting a huge amount of their mental effort to stay on task, and they have very little capacity left to perform the intrinsic, the, very little capacity for the intrinsic load, which is essentially what we want them doing in the class. You may have a dyslexic student who's exerting a lot of effort to decode text, and so all their cognitive processing capacity is going here, and they have very little capacity to critically analyze the content or to comprehend that text, because the intrinsic load is exceeding their processing capacity. So what are some of the factors that might limit working memory for students? So we have students, particularly those with executive function challenges, ADHD, and so on, who often have core weaknesses in working memory, attention, and executive functions. And for those students, they have a smaller working memory capacity to start off with. So um, they don't necessarily have as large a capacity as some of their neurotypical peers, at least in terms of working memory capacity. Then we may have students who have language processing deficits. Language processing is a load that many students have to tackle during most learning tasks, but for a student with language processing difficulties, that's quite a heavy load. Then we have students who have poorly automatized skills, and often that's a secondary effect of poor early education or insufficient early supports lead to poorly learned skills that aren't automatized, and they have a snowball effect where newer skills that rely on those former skills are impacted because the core skills aren't automatized yet. And then we have anxiety and affective issues. So students who are struggling, who are not making adequate process compared to their peers, often will develop anxiety, affective issues. They may develop learned helplessness. They may disengage from the content. But that worry about poor performance or anxiety about academic performance actually is an additional load that they have to deal with while performing all these tasks. So what can we do to help students reduce those loads and make learning tasks more manageable for them? First, we can work with students to automatize some of those skills. So when there are some weak core skills that the students have not developed proficiency in, we can go back and try to strengthen those skills. We can help students address some of the confidence and affective issues, and often success is the best way to reduce that cognitive processing load. For students who may not be able to automatize some skills, and there are certain skills that some students will never be fully proficient in. So a student with executive function challenges will always struggle to some extent with organization and time management and maintaining focus. But they can develop effective strategies to reduce the impact of those factors and on their cognitive processing load.